The next verse is spoken by Mahamuni. He addresses the Buddha as Mahamuni, great sage. So this is verse 671. As long as the notion of cause and effect is upheld, there is no difference between the philosophers. This is your teaching as well as that of other Buddhas, O Mahamuni. Such are not the wise ones. So the notion of cause and effect, as long as we subscribe to this notion, we are in a state of ignorance as opposed to wisdom. And just to reinforce this, we are told that this is the teaching of all the Buddhas. So it's very important that we get some angle on this. And cause and effect has been spoken of before. It's what reinforces our focus on the notion of an external world which has an independent reality. And this is a way of non-wisdom. And mention here is made of the philosophers. We're all philosophers in a sense. We've all got our take on reality, and unless we're enlightenment practitioners, that take on reality assumes that there's an external physical world which has a history. I was listening to a discussion on the radio. Well, it was a podcast of a radio program on BBC Radio. It's called In Our Time. It's quite a long running series dealing with cultural, scientific, philosophical issues. And this particular episode, this particular podcast was on consciousness. And there were two rather brilliant minds invited to talk on this subject. One was the scientist and mathematician Roger Penrose, and the other the philosopher Ted Hondrick, who I'd never really heard of before. I'd heard of Roger Penrose and tried to read a couple of his books. He's somebody that I'm somewhat in awe of. Yeah, he has a brilliant mind. And he spoke about the need for a new physics. We have quantum physics, which operates at the level of the very small, and we have classical Newtonian physics, which happens at the level of ordinary life. And they're quite different things. So what Penrose was saying, we need a new physics which bridges between these two. Bridges between quantum physics, physics of the very small, and everyday physics. There doesn't seem to be any bridge between the two. Where do the rules of quantum mechanics stop and the rules of Newtonian physics begin? So I thought this is quite an interesting question. And Penrose reckons, for reasons that I'm not very clear about, that the solution to what is consciousness lies with that as yet unknown physics. Now Ted Hondrick kept trying to pin down what Penrose was getting at in terms of what he means by consciousness. And he quite early on pointed out a bit of confusion. First of all, they were asked what is consciousness, but very quickly the discussion shifted focus on to what gives rise to consciousness. And they're two quite different things, aren't they? What is consciousness and what gives rise to it? Now Ted Hondrick, in his answer to the question what is consciousness, he said, well, it wasn't very clear actually, but it was tied up with the existence of the world. And I thought, this is interesting. This is interesting. It'd have been quite good if he'd had a chance to develop this, to develop what he said here. But unfortunately it didn't happen. And he started having a go at Penrose's, and he kept trying to pin down what Penrose meant by consciousness. And he said, well, he didn't really know. And he confessed that he didn't understand what Hondrick was talking about. So that was quite reassuring. I haven't read any of Ted Hondrick's books, but he seems to have written quite a bit about consciousness. And perhaps it would have been better if it was just him in the programme, because they seem to be talking at cross purposes. I suppose Roger Penrose was there because he represents the scientific interest in consciousness, whereas Ted Hondrick seems to have looked into this very thoroughly about what consciousness is. Now, as I said, they seem to be talking at cross purposes. And the idea that there's something which gives rise to consciousness, this is something which I think needs to be questioned, and I don't think either of them questioned this. Why should something give rise to consciousness? There's an inbuilt prejudice here that consciousness somehow comes after everything else. And I think the problem is when you start talking about consciousness as an objective thing. When you start talking about consciousness as an objective thing, it is no longer consciousness. Consciousness is subjective. That's it. When you start objectifying consciousness, it's like drawing a map. When you draw a map of the terrain, you're doing something else. The map is not part of the terrain. And yet, you can forget the terrain completely and just focus on the map. If you're wanting to get from A to B, just follow the map. You don't need to look at the terrain. The map is not the terrain. And yet the map is so useful that we give up on the terrain. We want that map. The map becomes what is real. The map becomes the substitute for the terrain. And this is what happens. This is what happens when we objectify consciousness. It's very useful perhaps to be able to do this. You know, you can tell if somebody's dead or not by the activity in their brain. If there's no activity in the brain, then they're dead. And this is tied up with the understanding of being conscious, of being alive. And when somebody has certain feelings or perhaps perceives a particular thing, then certain parts of the brain are lit up when you do some kind of brain scan. But all of that is not consciousness. The huge problem, which perhaps has been tackled, but I don't think it has been, I think it's just ignored, is how the objective becomes subjective. Penrose talks about the gap between Newtonian physics and quantum physics. But I think more importantly, there's a gap between the objective reality and subjective reality. There's no connection between the two, just as there's no connection between a map and the terrain. There's a correspondence which has been created between the map and the terrain, but the terrain is completely independent of the map. We can see the map as the objectification of the terrain, perhaps. I'm making an analogy here. but there's a complete discontinuity between the two. There's no point where the map becomes the terrain. They're completely separate things. One is reality and one is a construction. All objectivity is a construction. Reality is subjective. Consciousness is subjective. When you start objectifying consciousness and regarding it as a thing that has a cause, then you've lost sight of the terrain. You've lost sight of the nature of consciousness. You've lost sight of awareness. So this is the problem with all philosophers. They assume that consciousness has a cause. It'd be interesting to hear more about what Ted Hondrick has to say, because he does seem to be one of the leading thinkers in the field of consciousness. There's even a journal of consciousness studies. But one wonders whether any of it contributes to wisdom. I think the one point where both Hondrick and Penrose agreed was that it does have something to do with the brain. But then this is getting into cause and effect. So, consciousness is ultimately subjective. And we can realize this. It's actually so obvious. Consciousness is what is happening right now. We keep wanting to come back to the map though, come back to the objectification and say, well, maybe it's something to do with the brain and so on. And we can find lots of arguments for it. But we've got to come back to the immediacy of our own experiencing once again. Which is ultimately very simple. We don't need to think about it. We just need to realize the truth, the reality of this situation, which is independent of all ideas, independent of all objectifications. I said that consciousness is wholly subjective, but reality is wholly subjective. Science is caught up with trying to create an objective map, and that is fine. That is a valid activity. Why not? But let's not confuse the map with the terrain. You're forgetting the view altogether. You're getting caught up in on how wonderful this map is, how exquisitely drawn it is, how detailed it is. But that's nothing compared to the majesty of the terrain. We could even emphasize it even further by talking about a map of the Milky Way. I think they've managed to construct such a thing, three-dimensional map of the Milky Way. But how can that compare with the Milky Way itself? No matter how good and how clever that map is, how does it compare with the Milky Way itself? So, as Enlightenment practitioners, we once again appreciate the terrain of this consciousness which is hearing this. we forget how to appreciate it. We forget the miraculous nature of it, because our whole education is concerned with looking at maps, appreciating maps, appreciating objects, objectifications. But this part of ourselves is so insignificant compared to our reality. Everything that we're educated with, all the ideas that we're taught, the understandings that we're taught, it's all out there. It's all out there. Perhaps art, music, and maybe even sport give us some respite from that. But fundamentally, our education creates a massive imbalance, a massive denial of what we really are. But now we have the opportunity to redress the balance and come back to and appreciate this awareness which has no cause, because it's what comes first. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas, and it's the beginning of wisdom.